The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time. 23 years of service to the crown had taught him that some days would test every fiber of his being, but he never imagined that this particular Tuesday would become the day that would define his entire career. James had risen through the ranks with unwavering dedication, earning respect from his superiors and fellow guards alike. His father had served before him, and his grandfather before that, creating a legacy of loyalty that ran through his bloodline like an unbreakable chain. The Mitchell family had protected royalty for 3 generations, and James wore that responsibility like armor around his heart. The preparations for the annual royal ascot had been months in the making. Every detail had been scrutinized, every protocol reviewed, and every guest list checked and double-checked. The royal box, a symbol of prestige and privilege, would host only the most distinguished members of society alongside the royal family. James had memorized every name on the approved list, as was his duty and training. As he took his position at the entrance to the royal box, James felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The morning air was crisp, filled with the sounds of horses being prepared and the distant chatter of arriving guests. He stood tall, his polished boots reflecting the early sunlight, his expression calm and professional despite the nervous energy that always preceded such important events. The first guests began arriving shortly after 10 o'clock. James checked each name against his list with practiced efficiency, offering respectful nods and brief welcomes to familiar faces. Lady Catherine Pemberton arrived with her usual entourage, followed by several distinguished members of Parliament and prominent business leaders. Each interaction was brief, but cordial, a dance of protocol that James had performed countless times before. It was nearly 11 when he saw the familiar figure approaching from across the courtyard. Prince Andrew walked with the confident stride that came from a lifetime of privilege, his casual attire suggesting he expected no obstacles to his entry. James felt his pulse quicken slightly, not from excitement, but from a growing sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. The prince approached the entrance with the expectation of automatic admission that had characterized his entire life. His face carried the relaxed expression of someone who had never been denied access to anything, anywhere. James straightened his posture and prepared for what he assumed would be a routine interaction. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice steady and respectful as he had been trained. But as he looked down at his carefully maintained list, his heart began to sink. Prince Andrew's name was nowhere to be found among the approved guests. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. James scanned the list again, hoping he had somehow missed it, that his eyes had simply overlooked the familiar name. But the truth was undeniable. Prince Andrew was not on the approved guest list for the royal box. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," James began, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like stones in his throat. "But your name is not on the list for today's event." The change in Prince Andrew's expression was immediate and dramatic. The casual confidence evaporated, replaced first by confusion, then by something much darker. His eyes narrowed as he processed what he had just heard, the words seeming to echo in the space between them. "I beg your pardon?" Prince Andrew's voice carried a sharp edge that James had never heard before. "There must be some mistake. I am Prince Andrew, Duke of York. I don't need to be on any list." James felt sweat beginning to form beneath his collar despite the cool morning air. This was the moment every royal guard dreaded, the collision between duty and personal loyalty, between protocol and relationships that spanned decades. He had known Prince Andrew since the prince was a young man, had watched him grow up within the walls of various royal residences. "I understand, Your Royal Highness," James replied, his training taking over even as his heart raced. "However, I have strict instructions to admit only those whose names appear on this approved list. I'm certain this is simply an administrative oversight that can be resolved quickly." But even as he spoke the words, James knew this was no simple oversight. In 23 years of service, He had never seen a senior member of the royal family excluded from such an event without explicit reason. The implications began to dawn on him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Prince Andrew stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Sergeant Mitchell, isn't it? I remember you from Balmoral. Your family has served mine for generations. Surely you understand that some protocols are more flexible than others." The personal appeal hit James like a physical blow. The prince was right. Their families' histories were intertwined across decades of loyal service. James's father had spoken fondly of serving Prince Andrew during his naval career, had expressed pride in the prince's military service during the Falklands War. The weight of that shared history pressed down on James's shoulders like lead. "Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice growing steadier with each word, "I have the utmost respect for you and your service to the crown. However, my orders today are very specific. No one enters the royal box without appearing on this list." The standoff that developed seemed to freeze time itself. Other guests had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding at the entrance. Whispered conversations started among those waiting behind Prince Andrew, their curiosity evident as they tried to understand why anyone would dare to delay a member of the royal family. James could feel the eyes of his fellow guards upon him, some positioned nearby, others watching from their own posts around the perimeter. He knew they were all thinking the same thing. How had one of their own ended up in this impossible position? The code among royal guards was clear: protect the monarchy, follow orders, maintain dignity at all costs. But what happened when those principles came into conflict? Prince Andrew's face had grown red with embarrassment and anger. The public nature of the rejection was clearly as painful as the rejection itself. Here was a man who had spent his entire life as one of the most privileged people in the world, suddenly being told he could not enter a space that his family essentially owned. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Prince Andrew hissed, his composure finally cracking. "Do you understand the position you're putting yourself in? The position you're putting your family in?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and it cut James to his core. His family's livelihood, their reputation, their entire future was tied to their service to the crown. But so too was their honor, their integrity, their commitment to duty above all else. James felt as though he were being torn in half by forces beyond his control. Behind Prince Andrew, the line of waiting guests had grown longer. James could see familiar faces among them. Lords and ladies, politicians and business leaders, all watching this unprecedented drama unfold. Some appeared shocked. Others seemed almost fascinated by the spectacle of a royal being denied access anywhere. "Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice now carrying a note of finality, "I must respectfully ask you to speak with the event coordinator about having your name added to the list. Until that happens, I cannot permit entry to the royal box." The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. James knew there was no taking them back now, no pretending this conversation had never happened. He had crossed a line that few in his position had ever dared to approach, let alone cross. Prince Andrew's eyes blazed with a fury that seemed to consume the air around them. For a moment, James thought the prince might actually attempt to push past him, to force his way into the royal box through sheer determination and royal privilege. The tension was so thick it seemed almost tangible, like electricity in the air before a lightning strike. But then something unexpected happened. Prince Andrew seemed to deflate slightly, as if the full weight of his situation was finally sinking in. The anger remained in his eyes, but it was now mixed with something else. A dawning recognition that this confrontation was about much more than a simple administrative error. "This is about much more than a list, isn't it?" Prince Andrew said quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the racing preparations. James felt his heart breaking as he looked into the prince's eyes and saw, perhaps for the first time, a man beginning to understand the full consequences of choices made far from this moment, far from this place. But his duty remained clear, unwavering despite the personal cost. "I can only follow the orders I've been given, Your Royal Highness," James replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging in his chest. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard. The sounds of the gathering crowd grew louder as more guests arrived for what was supposed to be one of the most prestigious social events of the year. But for James Mitchell and Prince Andrew, the world had narrowed to this single moment, this impossible confrontation that neither had wanted, but both were now trapped within. As they stood facing each other, guard and prince, duty and privilege, the future and the past, both men knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The foundations of relationships built over generations were shifting beneath their feet, and the consequences of this moment would ripple far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. The list in James's hands suddenly felt like the heaviest thing he had ever carried, weighted with implications he was only beginning to understand. But his grip remained firm, his resolve unshaken, even as his heart broke for the man standing before him. A prince without a kingdom, a royal without access to his own family sanctuary. The confrontation was far from over, and James knew that the hardest moments were yet to come. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing second. James Mitchell stood his ground, but inside his chest his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. He had never imagined that his unwavering loyalty to duty would one day put him in direct opposition to a member of the royal family he had sworn to serve and protect. Prince Andrew's face had cycled through several emotions in the span of just a few minutes: confusion, anger, disbelief, and now something that looked disturbingly like desperation. The prince glanced around the courtyard, taking in the growing crowd of onlookers who were pretending not to stare while hanging on every word of this unprecedented exchange. "Sergeant Mitchell," Prince Andrew said, his voice taking on a different tone now, one that was almost pleading. "You've known me since I was barely out of university. You were there when I returned from the Falklands. You stood guard while I celebrated my wedding to Sarah. Surely that history counts for something." The personal appeal hit James harder than any direct command could have. Memories flooded back, unbidden. Images of a younger Prince Andrew, full of life and promise, celebrating his naval victories, his wedding day filled with hope and joy. James remembered standing at attention during those happier times, feeling pride in serving such a decorated war hero, someone who had genuinely put his life on the line for his country. But he also remembered more recent years, the whispered conversations among the staff, the careful way certain topics were avoided in official briefings, the growing distance between Prince Andrew and other members of the royal family. The signs had been there for those who knew how to read them, subtle changes in protocol that spoke volumes about shifting dynamics within the monarchy. "Your Royal Highness," James began, his voice heavy with the weight of shared history. "Those memories are precious to me, and they always will be. But today I have been given specific orders, and I must follow them regardless of personal feelings." Lady Catherine Pemberton, who had been waiting patiently in the growing line behind Prince Andrew, stepped forward slightly. Her expression was one of barely concealed fascination mixed with social awkwardness. She had clearly never witnessed such a confrontation, and James could see her mentally cataloging every detail to share at dinner parties for years to come. "Perhaps," Lady Catherine interjected delicately, "there's been some sort of communication error. These things do happen with such large events." Prince Andrew seized on her suggestion like a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. "Exactly. Catherine's absolutely right. There's obviously been some mistake in the administration. Sergeant Mitchell, surely you can make an exception just this once while we sort out the paperwork." James felt the weight of multiple gazes upon him now. The other guests in line were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. This had become the morning's entertainment, a real-life drama unfolding before their eyes. He could see some of them pulling out their mobile phones, though royal protocol strictly forbade photography at such events. "I'm afraid I cannot make exceptions, Your Royal Highness," James replied, his voice growing firmer. "My orders were very clear. No one enters without appearing on the approved list. No exceptions were mentioned." The finality in his voice seemed to strike Prince Andrew like a physical blow. The prince took a step backward, his face pale now, except for two bright spots of color high on his cheeks. For the first time in his life, he was being denied access to something by virtue of who he was rather than being granted access because of it. From across the courtyard, James caught sight of his superior officer, Captain William Hayes, approaching with quick, purposeful strides. Hayes was a veteran of 30-year service, a man who had navigated more delicate situations than most people could imagine. His expression was carefully neutral, but James could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Captain Hayes said as he approached, his tone perfectly respectful but professional. "Sergeant Mitchell, is everything proceeding smoothly here?" The question was loaded with meaning that all three men understood immediately. Hayes was offering James a way out, a chance to defer the responsibility to someone of higher rank who might be better equipped to handle such a sensitive situation. But James surprised himself with his response. "Captain Hayes, His Royal Highness is requesting entry to the royal box, but his name does not appear on today's approved guest list. I have informed him that I cannot grant access without proper authorization." Captain Hayes's eyebrows rose slightly at James's unwavering stance. In the military hierarchy, junior officers were expected to pass difficult decisions up the chain of command, not stand firm on their own authority. But Hayes also recognized the integrity in James's position. "I see," Hayes said slowly, his mind clearly working through the political implications of the situation. "Your Royal Highness, I'm certain this is simply an administrative oversight. If you could give me just a few minutes to contact the Palace Protocol Office, I'm sure we can have this resolved immediately." Prince Andrew's relief was visible, his shoulders sagging slightly as he sensed a potential resolution to this humiliating standoff. "Of course, Captain Hayes, I appreciate your understanding of the situation." But as Hayes stepped aside to make his phone call, James remained at his post, the guest list still clutched firmly in his hand. He watched as Hayes spoke in low, urgent tones into his mobile phone, the conversation clearly growing more complex with each passing minute. The crowd of waiting guests had grown restless. Some had begun to murmur among themselves, their voices carrying just loudly enough for fragments of conversation to reach James's ears. He heard speculation about administrative errors, family disputes, and worse. The gossip mill that fed on royal news was already beginning to turn. Lady Margaret Thornberry, one of the Queen's longtime friends, approached the group with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. She had witnessed enough royal protocol in her 8 decades to recognize when something significant was occurring beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple misunderstanding. "Andrew, dear," she said gently, her voice carrying the authority that came with decades of friendship with the royal family. "Perhaps it would be best to wait in the private lounge while this gets sorted out. These administrative matters can be so tedious in public." Her suggestion was clearly an attempt to give Prince Andrew a graceful way to remove himself from the increasingly public embarrassment of being denied entry. But the prince seemed rooted to the spot, as if leaving now would represent some kind of final defeat. "I shouldn't have to wait anywhere," Prince Andrew said, his voice rising slightly. "This is my family's event and my family's property. I've attended Royal Ascot since I was a child. The idea that I need special permission is absolutely ridiculous." James felt a pang of sympathy for the prince's obvious distress, but his resolve remained firm. He had been entrusted with a responsibility, and he would not abandon it regardless of the personal cost. The weight of his family's generations of loyal service actually strengthened his position rather than weakening it. He would not be the Mitchell who failed in his duty. Captain Hayes ended his phone call and returned to the group, his expression grave. James could tell immediately that the news was not what Prince Andrew had hoped to hear. Hayes's military bearing was intact, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of disappointment and regret. "Your Royal Highness," Hayes began carefully, "I've spoken with the Palace Protocol Office, and they've confirmed that today's guest list was approved at the highest levels. They've also confirmed that no changes or additions can be made without going through proper channels, which would require several hours at minimum." The words hit Prince Andrew like a series of physical blows. His face went through another rapid series of expressions, hope dying, anger returning, and finally settling into something that looked like grim acceptance mixed with defiance. "Several hours?" Prince Andrew repeated, his voice barely controlled. "The races will be over by then. Are you telling me that I, a senior member of the royal family, am being barred from attending an event at my own family's racecourse because of bureaucratic red tape?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and James realized that this moment had moved far beyond a simple administrative error. This was about power, about position, about the changing nature of the monarchy itself. He was witnessing something historic, even if he couldn't yet fully comprehend its significance. "I'm telling you what I've been told, sir," Hayes replied diplomatically. "The protocols exist for everyone's security and safety, including your own." Prince Andrew's laugh was bitter and sharp. "My security and safety? From whom? From my own family? From people I've known for decades?" He gestured toward the assembled guests. What threat could these people possibly pose that requires such extraordinary measures? James found himself thinking about the changes he had witnessed over his years of service. The security protocols had indeed grown more complex and restrictive as the years passed, but they had always applied to everyone equally. No exceptions, no special treatment, no matter how uncomfortable that might make certain individuals. The morning sun was now beating down more intensely, and James could feel perspiration beginning to soak through his uniform. The crowd of waiting guests had grown larger and more restless, their patience clearly wearing thin. Some had begun to check their watches and make pointed comments about the delay. Lord Pemberton, Lady Catherine's husband, stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems through wealth and influence. "Perhaps there's another entrance we could use? Surely there must be some alternative arrangement that could be made for His Royal Highness." But Captain Hayes shook his head firmly. "All access to the royal box goes through this checkpoint, sir. There are no alternative entrances available." The systematic closing off of options seemed to be having a profound effect on Prince Andrew. James could see the prince's worldview shifting in real time, the comfortable assumptions of a lifetime being challenged by the reality of his current situation. For someone who had never been denied anything, the experience was clearly transformative in ways that went far beyond simple frustration. "This is about the interviews, isn't it?" Prince Andrew said suddenly, his voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. "This is about the settlements, the associations, the whole bloody mess that's been following me around for years." The admission fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the assembled crowd. James felt his stomach clench as he realized they had moved from administrative error into much more dangerous territory. This was no longer about protocol or paperwork. This was about accountability, consequences, and the price of past decisions. The silence that followed Prince Andrew's words was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of horses and the increasingly agitated murmurs of the waiting guests. James stood perfectly still, his training keeping him composed even as he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. This was no longer just about following orders or checking names against a list. This had become something much larger, much more significant, and much more dangerous for everyone involved. Prince Andrew's admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire cannon, impossible to ignore and laden with implications that reached far beyond the immediate confrontation. James Mitchell felt the world shift around him as he realized this was no longer about protocol or administrative errors. This was about accountability, justice, and the fundamental question of whether anyone, regardless of birth or title, was truly above the consequences of their actions. The crowd of waiting guests had gone completely silent, their earlier murmurs replaced by an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air around them. Lady Catherine Pemberton's hand had gone to her throat in a gesture of shock, while her husband stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Captain Hayes moved closer to James, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Sergeant Mitchell, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. What happens here today will be remembered for decades. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" James looked into his captain's eyes and saw something he had never seen before: genuine uncertainty. Hayes had navigated countless delicate situations throughout his career, but this was uncharted territory for all of them. The question wasn't just about following orders anymore. It was about the integrity of the institution they had all sworn to serve. "Captain," James replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I've been prepared for this responsibility since the day I took my oath. My orders are clear, and I will follow them regardless of the personal cost." Prince Andrew, who had been watching this exchange with growing agitation, stepped forward again. His earlier attempts at charm and personal appeal had been replaced by something harder, more desperate. The mask of royal composure was slipping, revealing the raw, human emotions beneath. "You don't understand what you're doing," Prince Andrew said, his voice intense with urgency. "This isn't just about me. This is about the monarchy itself, about stability, about tradition. Do you really want to be remembered as the guard who helped tear down everything your family has served for generations?" The emotional manipulation was skillful, targeting exactly the values and loyalties that had defined James's entire life. But instead of weakening his resolve, it seemed to strengthen it. James thought about his grandfather, who had served King George VI with unwavering integrity, who had never once compromised his principles for convenience or personal gain. "Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice carrying a new note of quiet authority, "my family has served the crown with honor for 3 generations. We have never betrayed that trust, and we never will. But service to the crown means service to the institution, not to any individual within it. The monarchy is bigger than any one person, including you." The words struck Prince Andrew like physical blows. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was being lectured about the nature of the monarchy by someone he had always considered a servant. The role reversal was profound and deeply unsettling for everyone present. Lady Margaret Thornberry, who had been observing the scene with the sharp intelligence of someone who had witnessed 7 decades of royal history, stepped forward with the careful grace of a seasoned diplomat. "Andrew," she said gently but firmly, "perhaps it's time to consider that this situation is bigger than today's races. Sometimes we must accept difficult truths about the positions we find ourselves in." Her words carried weight that went far beyond their surface meaning. As someone who had been close to the royal family through multiple crises and scandals, Lady Margaret understood the delicate balance between public perception and private reality. She was suggesting, as diplomatically as possible, that Prince Andrew's exclusion might be justified by circumstances that everyone present understood, but no one wanted to speak aloud. Prince Andrew's face went through another series of rapid changes: denial, anger, and, finally, something that looked like the dawning recognition of a terrible truth. He looked around at the assembled crowd, seeing perhaps for the first time how they were really viewing him. Not with the deference and respect he had grown accustomed to, but with curiosity, judgment, and in some cases barely concealed disapproval. "You're all turning against me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the racecourse preparations. "My own people, my own staff, my own family. After everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed for this country, this is how I'm treated." James felt a profound sadness wash over him as he watched a man he had once respected grapple with the reality of his situation. But his duty remained clear, unchanged by the personal tragedy unfolding before him. "Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice gentle but unwavering, "I am not turning against you. I am following orders that were given to me by the proper authorities. Those orders reflect decisions made at levels far above my pay grade, based on considerations I may not fully understand but must respect." The rationality of James's position seemed to infuriate Prince Andrew even more than direct confrontation might have. Here was a man who was calmly, respectfully, but absolutely refusing to bend the rules for someone who had never been refused anything in his entire life. "Do you have children, Sergeant Mitchell?" Prince Andrew asked suddenly, his tone taking on a different quality. "I do, Your Royal Highness. 2 daughters. And what will you tell them about the day you humiliated a member of the royal family in public? What will you tell them about the day you chose bureaucracy over loyalty, rules over relationships. The question was designed to shake James's resolve by making the consequences personal and immediate. But instead of wavering, James found himself thinking about exactly what he would tell his daughters about this day. "I will tell them about the day I chose duty over convenience," James replied without hesitation. "I will tell them about the day I proved that some principles are more important than personal comfort or social pressure. I will tell them that sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing, but it's still the right thing." His words seemed to reverberate through the assembled crowd like ripples in a pond. Several of the waiting guests nodded almost imperceptibly, their respect for the young sergeant clearly growing with each exchange. Captain Hayes, who had been monitoring radio communications during the confrontation, approached the group again with news that would prove to be the turning point of the entire situation. "Your Royal Highness," Hayes said, his voice carefully controlled, "I've just received word from Buckingham Palace. The Palace Press Office has issued a statement confirming that your appearance at today's event would not be appropriate given current circumstances. They've requested that you respect this decision and withdraw your request for entry." The official nature of the rejection hit Prince Andrew like a thunderbolt. This was no longer about administrative errors or overzealous security guards. This was an official decision from the highest levels of the royal establishment, communicated through proper channels and backed by the full authority of the monarchy itself. "They can't do this to me," Prince Andrew whispered, but even as he spoke the words, it was clear that he knew they could, and they had. "I'm their brother, their son. They can't just cut me off like this." Lady Margaret placed a gentle hand on Prince Andrew's arm. "Dear boy," she said softly, "sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who must make the hardest decisions. This isn't about punishment, it's about protection. Protection of the institution, protection of the family, and, perhaps most importantly, protection of you." The wisdom in her words was undeniable, but Prince Andrew seemed unable or unwilling to accept it. He looked around the group one more time, his eyes finally settling on James Mitchell, the man who had become the physical embodiment of his exclusion from the life he had always known. "This isn't over, Sergeant Mitchell," Prince Andrew said, his voice low and intense. "This isn't over by a long shot." But even as he spoke the words, something in his tone suggested that he knew it actually was over. This confrontation had become a symbol of larger changes within the monarchy, changes that went far beyond one event or one exclusion. The old ways of doing things, the automatic deference to titles and birth, the assumption that blood trumped behavior, all of these were being challenged by the simple act of one guard refusing to bend the rules. James stood perfectly still, his uniform immaculate despite the emotional intensity of the morning, his bearing unchanged despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had become, quite without intending to, a symbol of institutional integrity in an age when such integrity was increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard. The sounds of the racecourse were growing louder as the day's events approached their scheduled start times. Other guests had begun to file past the confrontation, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with interest at witnessing such unprecedented drama. Prince Andrew stood for a long moment longer, seeming to struggle with the finality of what had just occurred. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away across the courtyard, his shoulders straight but his step lacking the confident stride with which he had arrived. As James watched him go, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the confrontation was over, sadness at the fall of someone he had once admired, and profound uncertainty about what the future would hold for all of them. The crowd of waiting guests began to move forward again, their patient wait finally at an end. As James checked each name against his list, he noticed that the interactions felt different now. There was a new level of respect in the way people looked at him, a recognition that he had been tested in the most difficult way possible and had not been found wanting. But as the morning wore on and the immediate crisis passed, James began to understand that this was really just the beginning. The ripples from this confrontation would spread far beyond the gates of Windsor Castle, touching lives and relationships that he couldn't even imagine. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a mantle he had never asked for but would now have to carry for the rest of his life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as the Royal Ascot races concluded, but for James Mitchell, the day felt as though it would never truly end. The confrontation with Prince Andrew had lasted less than an hour, yet it had fundamentally altered not just his career, but his understanding of what service to the crown really meant in the 21st century. As the last of the distinguished guests departed from the royal box, James remained at his post, mechanically completing his duties while his mind processed the magnitude of what had occurred. The list that had been the center of the morning's drama now felt like a historical document, a piece of paper that had somehow become the focal point of a moment that would be remembered and analyzed for decades to come. Captain Hayes approached as James was completing his final security checks of the area. The older officer's expression was thoughtful, carrying the weight of someone who understood that they had all been part of something much larger than a simple security protocol. "Mitchell," Hayes said quietly, "I want you to know that you handled yourself with exceptional professionalism today. What happened here will be discussed at the highest levels of the palace, and I suspect there will be consequences for all of us. But you should know that you did exactly what you were trained to do, exactly what the institution required of you." James nodded, accepting the praise while simultaneously feeling the burden of what it represented. "Thank you, Captain. But I keep thinking about what Prince Andrew said about my daughters. What will they think when they're old enough to understand what happened here today?" Hayes considered the question seriously before responding. "I think they'll be proud of their father. I think they'll understand that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones where we choose principles over convenience, duty over personal relationships. That's a lesson that will serve them well, regardless of what path they choose in life." But even as Hayes spoke these reassuring words, both men knew that the immediate future would be challenging. Word of the confrontation had already begun to spread through the networks of staff, security personnel, and media representatives who covered royal events. By evening, the story would be making its way through the corridors of power in Westminster and Whitehall. James thought about his journey home that evening, about facing his wife Margaret, and trying to explain why their comfortable, predictable life might be about to change dramatically. Margaret had always been proud of his service, had understood the demands and protocols that governed their lives. But she had also worried about the day when those demands might conflict with their family's well-being. As he drove through the gates of Windsor Castle for what might be the last time as an active-duty royal guard, James reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 24 hours earlier, he had been a respected but anonymous member of the royal security apparatus. Now he was the man who had told a prince that his name was not on the list, the guard who had chosen institutional integrity over personal loyalty. The drive home took him through the villages and countryside that had shaped his understanding of duty and service. These were communities where reputation and family history mattered, where the choices of one generation influenced the prospects of the next. James knew that his decision that morning would become part of his family's story, passed down to future generations as an example of something, though he wasn't entirely sure yet whether it would be remembered as courage or folly. When he arrived home, Margaret was waiting in their small garden, tending to the roses that had been her passion for 20 years of marriage. She looked up as he approached, and he could see in her eyes that she already knew something significant had happened. News traveled fast in the small community of royal employees, and the networks of communication among their families were both intimate and efficient. "How bad is it?" she asked simply, setting down her gardening tools and giving him her full attention. James sat beside her on the garden bench they had built together during his first leave after returning from overseas duty. The familiar weight of her hand in his provided an anchor of stability in what felt like an increasingly uncertain world. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I follow my orders, I did what I was trained to do, but the consequences are going to be complicated." Prince Andrew was not happy about being denied entry, and the situation became quite public. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her practical mind working through the implications of what he had told her. She had grown up in a family that had also served the crown in various capacities, and she understood the delicate balance between loyalty, duty, and self-preservation that governed their lives. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally. The question struck to the heart of James's internal struggle. He thought about Prince Andrew's face during their confrontation, the mixture of anger, bewilderment, and growing understanding that had played across the prince's features. He thought about the assembled guests, their shock and fascination at witnessing such an unprecedented scene. Most importantly, he thought about his own daughters and the legacy he wanted to leave them. "No," he said with growing conviction. "I don't regret it. The monarchy is bigger than any individual, including Prince Andrew. If we start making exceptions to our protocols based on personal relationships or family connections, then we compromise the integrity of everything we're supposed to protect." Margaret squeezed his hand, her silent support speaking volumes about the strength of their partnership and shared values. They had faced difficult times before, during his deployments, during family illnesses, during the various crises that touched all military families. But this felt different, more consequential, because it touched on questions of principle and identity that went to the core of who they were as people. Over the following days, the ripples of James's decision spread far beyond their immediate circle. Phone calls came from superior officers, from palace officials, from journalists who had somehow obtained his personal information. The attention was overwhelming and sometimes frightening, but it also revealed the depth of support for his position from unexpected quarters. Letters arrived from fellow service members, from retired royal employees, from ordinary citizens who had followed the story in the media. Many expressed admiration for his integrity and courage. Others criticized his decision to embarrass a member of the royal family in such a public manner. But all acknowledged that his choice had touched on fundamental questions about accountability, privilege, and the rule of law that resonated far beyond the specific circumstances of that morning at Windsor Castle. The formal inquiry came within a week, conducted by senior palace officials who needed to understand exactly what had occurred and why. James found himself in the unusual position of being both the subject of the investigation and its most important witness. He answered every question honestly and completely, providing a detailed account of his actions and the reasoning behind them. During the inquiry, he learned more about the context that had led to Prince Andrew's exclusion from the guest list. The decision had been made at the highest levels of palace administration, reflecting concerns about public perception and the ongoing controversies surrounding the prince's associations and legal difficulties. James's rigid adherence to protocol had simply been the mechanism through which a much larger institutional decision had been implemented. "You understand," one of the investigators told him during a private moment, "that you became the face of a very difficult decision that had to be made. In some ways, you made it easier for everyone else by simply following your orders without question or compromise." The comment was both reassuring and troubling. James was glad to know that his actions had been appropriate and necessary, but he was also aware that he had become a symbol of something he hadn't entirely understood at the time. His simple adherence to protocol had become a statement about justice, accountability, and the principle that no one should be above the law. The weeks following the inquiry brought unexpected developments. James was reassigned to a different position within the royal security apparatus, one that kept him away from direct contact with members of the royal family, but recognized his experience and capabilities. The reassignment was presented as a lateral move, neither a promotion nor a demotion, but everyone understood that it reflected the delicate nature of his situation. Margaret worried about his state of mind during this period of uncertainty. She could see him wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, struggling to understand his role in events that had grown far beyond anything he could have anticipated. Some evenings he would sit in their garden for hours, lost in thought, trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred and what it meant for their future. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he told her one evening as they watched their daughters playing in the yard. "I keep thinking about what Prince Andrew said about turning against him. But I never turned against him personally. I never made a judgment about his character or his actions. I simply followed the rules that apply to everyone equally. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly why what you did was so important. You weren't making personal decisions about who deserves what treatment. You were upholding the principle that everyone, regardless of their birth or position, has to follow the same rules. As the months passed, James began to understand the true significance of his decision in ways he hadn't initially comprehended. He had become an unintentional symbol of institutional integrity in an era when such integrity was increasingly rare and valuable. His story was cited in discussions about accountability, privilege, and the rule of law, not just in Britain, but around the world. The personal cost had been significant. His comfortable anonymity was gone forever. His relationship with certain colleagues had been strained, and his future career prospects remained uncertain. But he had also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that when tested in the most difficult circumstances imaginable, he had chosen principle over convenience, duty over personal comfort. Years later, when his daughters were old enough to understand the full story of that morning at Windsor Castle, James would tell them about the importance of doing the right thing even when it's difficult, even when it costs you something precious, even when you're not sure anyone will understand or appreciate your choice. He would tell them that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones where we choose to stand for something bigger than ourselves, where we decide that our principles matter more than our personal comfort or social acceptance. And he would tell them that while such choices are never easy, they're the ones that define who we really are when everything else is stripped away. The confrontation at the gates of the royal box had lasted less than an hour, but its lessons would last a lifetime. In the end, James Mitchell had discovered that true service to the crown meant serving the highest ideals it represented, not simply the individuals who happened to wear its symbols at any given moment. And in that discovery, he had found a sense of purpose and integrity that no amount of controversy or criticism could ever take away.